Ben worked 2 jobs, barely scraping by as the world outside his small, worn house continued its busy, unyielding march. His hands were calloused from the long hours, his back aching, but he never let that show. The truth was, every dollar he earned barely stretched far enough to cover his bills. His 3 kids, Charlie, Emma, and little Noah, needed new shoes, and every time he looked at them, it felt like his heart cracked a little more. The rent was overdue again, the landlord's threats heavier with each passing day. And his old truck, the one that had seen him through years of hardship, was finally showing signs of giving up, coughing and sputtering like it was on its last breath. But at night, when the weight of the world seemed unbearable, Ben did something he was getting better at. He forced a smile. It wasn't much, but it was the only armor he had left. He gathered his kids around, tucking them into the worn couch cushions, their little faces looking up at him with a blend of exhaustion and hope. His voice was warm, and his stories, though stretched beyond reason, were filled with adventure. He spoke of faraway places, where dreams came true and hunger was a thing of the past. The sound of their laughter, even when strained, helped him ignore the growling of their empty stomachs. "Daddy, tell us the one about the giant who lived on the moon," Emma asked, her eyes wide with innocent wonder. "Of course," Ben replied, the words flowing effortlessly from his lips. "Once upon a time, there was a giant who lived on the moon, and every night he ate stardust for dinner. Double quotes. As the night wore on, the shadows grew longer in their cramped living room, but Ben knew he was giving them something they needed just as much as food, a bit of hope. And hope, for a father like him, was worth more than anything else. He just had to hold on a little longer. Next door to Ben's modest home lived Mrs. Murphy, an 80-year-old widow whose presence had become a quiet part of the neighborhood's rhythm. Her house, though small and well-worn, was surrounded by a garden that always seemed to burst with color, especially the roses that bloomed like memories of better days. The iron fence that surrounded her property, however, was another story, a rusty relic of years past, creaking with age, much like the woman herself. She rarely spoke to anyone, choosing instead the quiet company of her flowers and the occasional wave from her porch. Ben had always admired her garden from afar, though he never thought to speak much to her. But one afternoon, as he walked home from his second job, he noticed her struggling with a heavy bag of groceries. She was bent over, every step a battle against the weight of the bags and her own frailty. Her thin, shaking hands gripped the handles, and it was clear she was having trouble managing the load. Without thinking, Ben jogged across the yard, his tired legs no longer feeling so heavy. "Let me help you with that," he offered, his voice rough from a long day but laced with sincerity. Mrs. Murphy looked up in surprise, then smiled faintly, though her eyes were clouded with weariness. "Oh, you don't have to, Ben. I can manage just fine." But Ben wasn't one to leave someone in need. He gently took the bags from her hands, lifting them with ease, and guided her slowly toward her front door. She seemed grateful, her frail frame almost swaying as she leaned on the doorframe for support. "Thank you, Ben," she said softly, her voice trembling but filled with gratitude. "You're a good man. Not many would bother." The words hung in the air, simple but deeply meaningful. He nodded in acknowledgement, unsure of how to respond. She had thanked him with a jar of homemade jam, something she had made with her own hands, and handed it to him with a smile. The warm sweetness of the jar felt like a silent bond between them. The following day, a heavy storm swept through the neighborhood. Ben woke to the sound of raindrops hammering against the windows, and when he stepped outside to inspect his truck, he saw it. Mrs. Murphy's old fence, already leaning dangerously, had finally succumbed to the storm. One side had collapsed, its wooden posts splintered and sagging like the fragile bones of a forgotten memory. Without a second thought, Ben grabbed his tools. His truck might be on its last legs, and his own life might feel like it was unraveling at the seams, but this he could fix. He knew what it was like to be left with nothing but the remnants of something that had once been whole. As he worked, the steady rhythm of hammering helped calm his troubled mind. Mrs. Murphy watched from her porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Her gaze, soft but observant, followed his every move. Ben could hear her humming quietly to herself, a sound of peace amidst the storm. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, something tangible. And for a few hours, it was just him, the hammer, and the hope that something could still be rebuilt, no matter how broken it seemed. "You don't have to do that, Ben," Mrs. Murphy called out, her voice raspy yet filled with concern. She stood in the doorway, leaning against the wooden frame, her wrinkled hands clutching a cup of tea. Her eyes, though dimmed by age, still held a glimmer of quiet strength. "It's an old fence. You've got enough to worrying about." Ben paused, his hammer in midair, his body covered in a sheen of sweat. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and looked up at her, smiling through the exhaustion. "It's no trouble, Mrs. Murphy," he reassured her, his voice steady. "It's the least I can do. You've helped me more times than I can count." She shook her head softly, reluctant but grateful. "You're a good man, Ben," she said, her voice trailing off as she watched him continue his work. There was something in her tone, something that made Ben's heart ache slightly, a silent weight behind her words that he couldn't quite place. With a grunt of effort, Ben hammered the next nail into the splintered wood, the rhythmic sound of metal against timber steadying his nerves. The old fence creaked but held firm as the posts slowly began to straighten under his careful touch. His hands, though calloused and worn, worked with a precision that surprised him. Each swing of the hammer felt like a small victory, as if, for once, he was doing something right. In the yard, his 3 kids, Charlie, Emma, and little No, ran and played, their laughter filling the air. They chased each other through Mrs. Murphy's garden, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the sweet smell of rain-soaked earth. Mrs. Murphy, always the gracious hostess, had brought them lemonade and cookies, her wrinkled hands offering the treats with a smile that reached her eyes. Ben's heart swelled as he watched his children, their faces glowing with innocence and joy. For a moment, the weight of his burdens lifted, replaced by the sight of his kids' laughter. It was like a spark of light in the darkness, a brief flicker of hope that perhaps everything wasn't lost. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that anything could change. Maybe this fence, this small act of kindness, was a sign that good things were still possible. That there was still hope for him, for his family. The rain had stopped, leaving only a damp silence in its wake, but Ben felt the warmth of that hope settle in his chest. Even as his world felt like it was constantly on the verge of falling apart, moments like this reminded him that kindness, however small, could still make a difference. He smiled to himself, swinging the hammer once more, determined to finish what he'd started. And maybe, just maybe, that small spark would grow into something bigger than he ever imagined. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, Ben found himself drawn deeper into Mrs. Murphy's world. What had started as a simple gesture fixing a fence had evolved into a quiet routine that brought him comfort amidst the chaos of his life. Every morning before work, he'd swing by her house, often with his kids in tow, and tackle another task on her long list of home repairs. A broken faucet, a clogged drain, a squeaky door, nothing was too small for Ben to fix. He took pride in knowing he was helping, even if it was only one small piece of her world at a time. Mrs. Murphy, for her part, never asked for anything in return, but her gratitude was always apparent. Each day, she would surprise him with something: a jar of homemade jam, a plate of warm cookies, or a basket of fresh herbs from her garden. She would always find a way to show her appreciation, her old hands working diligently to give back, despite her frail health. Some evenings, after the work was done and the sun began to set, Ben would sit on her porch with her, listening to her stories. She spoke with a soft, wistful tone about her years as a nurse, traveling across the world, helping the sick in places most people could only read about in books. Her eyes would sparkle as she described the adventures she had, and for a moment, Ben would forget his own struggles. He would listen intently, marveling at the life she'd led, a life so full of purpose and passion. In return, Ben would share his own stories, his dreams, his worries, his unspoken fears for his children. Mrs. Murphy listened to him the way no one else did. Her presence was a quiet refuge in a world that often felt too loud, too overwhelming. Her words were always simple, yet somehow they carried the weight of a lifetime of wisdom. "Ben," she'd say, as she handed him a fresh batch of cookies one afternoon, "you're a good man. I see how you care for your kids, how you keep fighting, even when the odds are stacked against you. Life's about to repay you, I promise you that." He'd chuckle and shake his head, unsure of what she meant. Life had been hard, but it had never felt like it was about to hand him a break. And yet, her words lingered in his mind, like a distant promise, one he didn't dare to believe, but couldn't help but hope for. As the weeks passed, Ben found himself thinking more and more about Mrs. Murphy's quiet confidence. She had lived a full life, one filled with kindness and resilience. And now, in her old age, she was giving him something he hadn't realized he'd needed. A reminder that kindness, though often overlooked, could be the key to finding hope when all seemed lost. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the ambulance pull up to Mrs. Murphy's house. It was a cold morning, the kind that made your breath turn to fog in the air. He'd been there just the night before, helping her fix a leaky faucet, listening to her laugh at one of his silly stories about his kids. Now, she was lying on her bed, her frail body weaker than usual, her face pale. "She's going to be okay, right?" he asked the paramedics, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. But they just exchanged glances, their faces grim. One of them gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's in good hands. We'll take care of her." Ben followed them into the house, but Mrs. Murphy was barely conscious. Her eyes fluttered open as she saw him standing by her side. She smiled weakly, her hand reaching out to grasp his. "Ben," she whispered, her voice thin, "under the roses. Check under the roses." Her words were almost lost in the room's quiet hum, but Ben caught them barely and his heart skipped a beat. What did she mean? Why the roses? Before he could ask, the paramedics were ushering him out of the room, preparing her for transport to the hospital. Ben stood frozen in the doorway, watching them take her away. For a moment, all he could hear was the echo of her words. Check under the roses. It made no sense. What could possibly be hidden there? But something in the urgency of her voice told him he had to go, he had to find out. He rushed out of the house, heart pounding, not caring about the cold air biting at his face. His hands shook as he crouched down in Mrs. Murphy's garden, his fingers trembling as he brushed aside the dew-covered leaves. The roses, those beautiful, resilient flowers that had flourished year after year, were still vibrant, despite the harsh weather. Ben dug into the soil, his hands raw from the cold and the dirt. For a moment, he thought he might be overreacting, but then, just as he was about to give up, his fingers brushed something hard. He pulled it out, a small, rusted metal box, his breath caught in his throat. He knew instantly that this was what she had meant. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside was a stack of cash, neatly wrapped in rubber bands, stock certificates, and a letter its edges yellowed with age. Ben sat back on his heels, feeling the weight of it all. Mrs. Murphy had left him something, but he couldn't understand why. She had always been kind, selfless in ways Ben had never fully grasped. He was overwhelmed with a sudden sense of guilt, unsure if he had ever truly understood how much she had given him. But it was the letter that caught his attention the most. He unfolded it carefully, reading the neat handwriting that Mrs. Murphy had so often shared with him over the years. "Dear Ben, this money is from the sale of my clinic years ago. I saved it for someone who treat people as kindly as I tried to. Take care of your children, and plant new roses, will you?" Ben's heart ached as he read the words again, the truth sinking in slowly. Mrs. Murphy had watched him. She had seen his kindness, his struggle, his love for his family. And in the quiet, unseen corners of her own life, she had been preparing to give him something that would change everything. Tears welled up in his eyes as he realized what this meant, not just for him, but for his children. She had given him the chance to start over, to rebuild, to dream again. This was her gift to him, the way she had repaid him for his kindness. But there was more hidden in the box. Wrapped alongside the money was another journal. As he opened it, Ben found page after page of Mrs. Murphy's thoughts, her life, her past. One entry caught his attention, a heart-wrenching note written years ago about the loss of her son, a pain she had carried with her for decades. She hadn't just given him money, she had healed a wound in her own heart by giving her love to him, and through him, to his children. Ben stood up, clutching the box to his chest. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, as if whispering their approval. He knew he had to make the most of this gift. Not just the money, but the life he had been given, a second chance, a new beginning. And as he looked at the roses blooming around him, he whispered a promise to Mrs. Murphy, even though she was no longer there to hear it. "I'll take care of them. I'll take care of everything." The news hit Ben like a punch to the stomach. That evening, he sat alone on his couch, staring at the TV, the empty space beside him feeling colder than usual. He couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Murphy's frail, fading smile, or the way her hand had felt in his just moments before. He had known something was wrong, but he hadn't wanted to believe it. Not her. Not Mrs. Murphy, the woman who had, in so many ways, saved him when he didn't even know he needed saving. She had been his quiet guardian, watching over him with a grace that only someone who had seen the best and worst of life could understand. Now, she was gone. The sound of a knock at the door startled him. It was late, far too late for anyone to be visiting, but as he opened the door, he found a familiar face standing on his porch, the lawyer who had visited him earlier. "I'm sorry to bother you at this hour, Mr. Walker," the man said solemnly, holding a small folder in his hands. "But I need to speak with you about Mrs. Murphy." Ben's chest tightened. "Is she?" The lawyer nodded, his eyes filled with sympathy. "She passed away this evening. But she left instructions for you. She wanted you to know." Ben's stomach churned as the lawyer handed him the folder. He could barely focus on the words as he flipped it open, his fingers trembling. The letter inside was written in Mrs. Murphy's elegant handwriting, each word like a message from beyond the grave. It was a message meant for him. "Dear Ben, I know I've never said this enough, but I'm grateful for you. You've shown me the kind of kindness I never expected to receive again. I've left something for you, something I hope will help you take care of your children and start anew. But more than that, I hope it reminds you that in this world, goodness is always worth holding on to." Ben swallowed hard, the words blurring as tears welled in his eyes. He had never expected this. Mrs. Murphy had always been the one offering the kindness. He had never imagined she would think of him like this, as someone worthy of such a gift. With trembling hands, he pulled out the rest of the contents. Stock certificates, a few neatly folded bills. And there, nestled in the center of the envelope, was the letter he had already read, but it was the last line that stood out the most. "I've left a box for you. It's buried beneath the roses. Take care of them, Ben. They'll help you remember." Ben didn't know what to feel: relief, sadness, gratitude, or guilt. His heart ached as he closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he would go to her house. Tomorrow, he would dig beneath those roses she had always tended to so lovingly. Tomorrow, he would finally understand what she had meant, why she had wanted him to carry on her legacy in some small way. But for now, all he could do was sit in silence, his thoughts swirling with the memory of Mrs. Murphy, her gentle voice, her never-ending faith in him. And for the first time in a long while, Ben allowed himself to cry, the tears falling for both of them. Ben stood frozen in the doorway of Mrs. Murphy's house, the weight of the lawyer's words still settling in. Everything, his mind couldn't quite wrap around it. The woman who had quietly lived next door, the one who had always been there when he needed a kind word or a hand, had left him everything. The lawyer's voice broke through his thoughts. "She trusted you, Ben, more than anyone. That's why she made sure you'd be the one to take care of it." He nodded slowly, his throat tight. He wasn't sure what to feel. Shock, gratitude, guilt, it was too much all at once. But as he followed the lawyer out to the garden, toward the rosebush where Mrs. Murphy had spent countless hours tending to the flowers that were now blooming in the spring sun, Ben could only think about how she had always made him feel like he mattered. And now she was gone. The lawyer knelt down and brushed away the earth, his hands trembling as he uncovered the metal box that had been buried for so many years. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea what to expect, but as the box was lifted from the ground, a chill ran through him. "This is for you," the lawyer said, handing it over with reverence. Ben took the box with shaking hands, the cold metal unfamiliar against his skin. His mind raced. What could this woman have left him? Why him? Sitting on the small wooden bench beneath the rosebush, Ben carefully pried open the box. His heart pounded in his chest as he pulled out the first bundle of papers, stock certificates, neatly folded and tied with string. Then came the cash, more money than Ben had ever seen in his life. But it wasn't the money that stopped him. "For sale in Medin. I saved this money from the sale of that clinic. I didn't know who would come into my life after I left, but I knew it would be someone who would understand. Someone who would keep the goodness alive. You are that person. Take care of your children. Keep being the good man you are. And when life gets hard, remember there are always roses to be found, even in the toughest of times. Ben's eyes blurred with tears as he read the final lines. He hadn't known that Mrs. Murphy had lost her own child. That loss, the one she had never spoken of, was something she had carried for so long, something that he had unknowingly healed with his simple acts of kindness. The letter, the money, the stock certificates, these were all more than just a gift. They were a promise. A promise that Mrs. Murphy believed in him, in his ability to take care of his family, to do what was right. Ben closed his eyes, his hands trembling as he clutched the letter. He felt the weight of her belief in him, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't realized was missing. He could fix this. He could start over. He would take care of his children and honor her memory. And, as he stood up and looked at the roses blooming around him, he whispered to the wind, "I'll make sure life gives you more than you ever expected, Mrs. Murphy." Ben's hands trembled as he read the words, the weight of Mrs. Murphy's legacy sinking deep into his chest. The money from the sale of her clinic was not just a gift, it was a trust. A trust she had placed in him, believing that he was worthy of the responsibility she was leaving behind. A message, simple yet profound, cut through him like a razor: take care of your children. He could feel her kindness in every letter, every word, as if she were speaking directly to him, urging him to do better, to be better, to find a way out of the struggle, and to honor the small, quiet moments that had made her life meaningful. The part about the roses made him smile, even through the tears that blurred his vision. Mrs. Murphy had always loved her garden, always believed in the beauty of growth, no matter how hard life became. And now, Ben realized, he wasn't just planting roses for her. He was planting them for himself, for his future, for his children's future. The letter was not just a farewell, it was a call to action. A challenge to create something beautiful out of the pain and hardship that had marked so much of his life. "And plant new roses, will you?" Ben wiped the tears from his eyes, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The rose bushes surrounding him seemed to stand a little taller, their petals a little brighter, as if they too understood the promise he was now making. As Ben sat in the small, dimly lit room of Mrs. Murphy's house, the stack of journals in front of him seemed almost too heavy to lift. Each one was a testament to a life well lived, filled with memories and stories of love, loss, and healing. As he flipped through the pages, the words of a woman who had experienced so much began to come alive before him. Mrs. Murphy had never mentioned her son. She'd spoken of her travels, her time as a nurse, her love for roses, but not of the one loss that had shaped her entire existence. As Ben read her journals, the truth unfolded, a truth that made his heart ache with a mix of sorrow and understanding. She had lost her son, the one person who had meant everything to her. The son she had held in her arms and watched grow, only to have him ripped from her life far too soon. The pain of that loss had haunted her for decades, a quiet, invisible ache she had carried alone, until Ben came along. It wasn't the money or the things she had given him that had mattered most, it was the kindness he had shown her, the way he had treated her with respect, the way he had brought light into her lonely world. Ben's selflessness, his willingness to help without expectation, had reminded her of the love she had once known. In him, she had found a semblance of the son she had lost so many years ago. As Ben read the final entry in her journal, his eyes blurred with emotion. "I may never have been able to be the mother I wanted to be to my own son, but in Ben, I see hope. He's been a son to me in the most beautiful way. If anyone deserves to have their life changed, it's him." Ben closed the journal slowly, feeling the weight of Mrs. Murphy's secret, her pain, and her quiet gratitude. She had given him more than he could ever repay, and it wasn't just the money, it was the healing, the lessons, the love that had come to him when he least expected it. He felt as if he were standing at the edge of a new beginning, not just for his business, but for his life. Mrs. Murphy had left him more than a fortune, she had left him a legacy of compassion, of finding beauty in the simplest acts of kindness. And in that moment, Ben knew he would do whatever it took to honor her memory. For her, for his children, and for himself. Ben stood in front of his bustling repair shop, watching as customers came and went. The sound of tools at work filled the air, but it wasn't just the rhythm of his business that brought him peace, it was the life that had blossomed around him. His kids, once uncertain and struggling, were now full of energy and dreams, their backpacks heavy with books and their hearts lighter than they'd ever been. They were no longer hungry for more than just food. Now, they were hungry for knowledge, adventure, and a future they could look forward to. As he glanced across the street, he saw Mrs. Murphy's roses, their vibrant blooms stretching toward the sun. They seemed to glow with life, just as she had in her final days. It was as if her spirit lived on in each delicate petal, a reminder of the kindness and love she had shared with him. Ben's repair shop had transformed from a small, struggling venture into a thriving business, and as the years passed, it became a symbol of hope and resilience for the neighborhood. His reputation as a kind and honest man had spread, and soon people from all over came to him, not just for his expertise but for his warmth. He was no longer the man who struggled to make ends meet. He was someone others looked up to, a living testament to the power of kindness. One day, as he fixed a fence for an elderly couple down the street, a young man who had watched Ben work approached him. "How did you turn your life around?" the young man asked, admiration in his voice. "You came from nothing. How did you make it?" Ben smiled, wiping his brow, his hands covered in dirt and sweat but filled with pride. He looked over at the roses, the same ones Mrs. Murphy had once tended to, and then back at the young man. "Fix a fence," Ben said, his voice steady and filled with a quiet wisdom. "You never know what might grow." The young man looked confused for a moment, but then something in Ben's eyes clicked. The unspoken truth: how a simple act of kindness, a willingness to help, could lead to something greater. It wasn't just about fixing things. It was about repairing hearts, rebuilding trust, and sowing the seeds of a future that could bloom into something beautiful. Ben didn't need to explain further. He simply went back to his work, his heart full. Mrs. Murphy's lessons had stayed with him, guiding him every step of the way. He knew, now more than ever, that life had a way of surprising you, of giving you more than you could ever imagine, if only you had the courage to fix what was broken.